candidate everyone has been talking about, said the words everyone has been waiting to hear today. Kim Campbell is going after the leadership of the Conservative Party.
I think Canadians want their people in government to be businesslike and straightforward, to be down to earth. And you have to walk your talk. You have to behave in a way that's consistent with what you're saying.
I'm here today to announce that I will be a candidate for the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party. I'd like to change the way people think about politics in this country by changing the way we do politics in this country.
I, Kim Campbell, do solemnly and sincerely promise and swear.
After 18 men in the job, Canada's first woman Prime Minister, the turning of a tide in Canadian history.
Hey, I'm Rachael.
And I'm Amanda, and this is Beyond a Ballot.
Welcome back, Amanda. Am I dreaming? Because when we started out to have a conversation every week that engaged women into politics, our guest today was number one on the dream list. Mm-hmm. Now, to spend International Women's Day with her is almost unbelievable. We are so thrilled.
We are so thrilled to be able to sit back and break down the incredible life, political roles, and experiences of none other than Right Honorable, the first time we're ever saying that on this podcast, Kim Campbell, who's the former Prime Minister of Canada, the first and only woman to hold the office in Canada's history. Madam Prime Minister, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We are so thrilled to have you. And for those that don't know, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell was Canada's 19th Prime Minister. She served at all three levels of the Canadian government, was the first female Justice Minister, as well as the first Defense Minister. In fact, she was the first female Minister of Defense of any NATO country. She was the Consul General in Los Angeles until 2000, and in 2016, became the chairperson of the Independent Advisory Board for the Supreme Court of Canada Judicial Appointments, which she held until 2021. Not a bad resume. Mm-hmm. This episode, I know, will come as a very exciting announcement to many women in Canada. And that is because Canada's never had another woman in the Prime Minister's office. We want to start with your background and your path to the PMO. Can you tell us a little bit about you and what you were doing before you got involved in politics?
Well, it's interesting. I sometimes attribute my interest in politics to the fact that I was the daughter of two war veterans, and I was born just after World War II, but my dad was in the Canadian Army and fought in Italy, and my mom horrified her mother by enlisting in the Navy in 1943 when women were finally allowed to join the Navy. And she trained as a wireless operator, tracking the transmissions of German U-boats in the North Atlantic and Gulf of St. Lawrence. She was stationed in Eastern Canada. And so when I grew up, my mother had a great pride in having been able to, as she said, wear the King's uniform and to be part of something so much bigger than herself. And my dad used to say, we weren't heroes. We just knew there was a job that had to be done. So I think from both of them, I got this sense, first of all, of the incredible excitement and challenge of doing something much bigger than yourself, for a cause much bigger than yourself, but also answering the call when your country was faced with challenges or problems that for my parents' generation, their whole generation responded. And I don't know if you or your listeners know that I'm speaking to you from Italy, and I have been to visit Canadian war graves here in Italy and in France. And what many people might not know is that every Canadian who served overseas in combat in World War II was a volunteer. So we did have conscription, but conscripts could not be asked to serve overseas. So it was a hugely generous and wonderful expression of the belief that there was perhaps something bigger and more important than one's individual life, but also the challenge and the reward of being part of something. So I guess all my life I sort of felt that I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. And I always was the kind of person, I was too much the kind of person when something needed to be organized, I said, well, I'll do that. We need to do a little dance group for sports day. Well, I'll organize that. And, so I was always running around organizing things. Saying no was not my long suit, but I think that was really part of it. And I was born at a time when the politics of the world and the changes in society, there were a lot of challenges, and it was also an important time for girls. When I didn't think of going into politics so much, but when I was a teenager, I wanted to be the first woman Secretary General of the UN. I mean, that was more in the idea of world peace and all this kind of stuff. And so I was very conscious of the fact that there were a lot of things that women had not yet had a chance to do, but were eminently capable of doing them. So that was the other theme of my goals, my ambitions, and my desires for how I would make my life.
But so you said you hadn't really thought about politics. So it wasn't like you were a young girl dreaming of this idea of becoming the first woman prime minister in the country. So how do you go from, wanting to make a difference, wanting to serve, and then finding yourself in this unbelievable and once in our history role?
Well, it's interesting. When I was in high school, I was the first girl to be elected student council president of my high school.
Foreshadowing.
It isn't really, because school politics isn't really the same as country politics, and it's more like wanting to organize stuff. And in terms of being the first woman Secretary General of the UN, I didn't actually know how you would do that. I studied Soviet government as a field of study. I went to the London School of Economics to do graduate work there, and spent 3 months traveling in the Soviet Union, which gave me a very strong picture of what it was like to be in a place that wasn't a democracy. And I think my my philosophical commitment to the importance of democracy grew, and it was also not unattached to my desires to enhance the rights of women. The advancement of women was also very much linked to the ability of societies to make their own rules and to change them when they became outdated. And then my first husband ran for the school board in Vancouver, and then when he served a couple of terms, he was a mathematics professor. When he served a couple of terms, he wanted to run for city council. And his colleagues came to me and said, would you agree to run for the school board? And it was interesting. And I said, well, yes, because by that time I was teaching at UBC, and I had some opinions on how well my students were prepared. And I said, well, yeah, I'd be happy to do it. But of course, I would run under my own name, because Campbell is my maiden name, and I've never used any other name. It's kind of inconvenient for women who have to change their name. And they sort of went, oh, because they thought if I ran with my married name, because my husband had been elected twice and was very well known as the chair of the school board, that I'd be a shoo-in. Wow. But I wasn't interested. I was interested in running because I had ideas about education and and how that was organized in the city, but I wasn't interested in running just for the sake of getting elected so that my husband's party could stay in control of the school board. So make a long story short, I did run, and I ran under my own name, and he ran, and he was elected to city council, but I actually got more votes than he did. So anyway, that was how I started. But what was interesting was I thought the issues were important, and so that was the reason why I agreed to do it. But when I got there, I discovered that I really enjoyed it, that I thought it was important. I found it challenging. I enjoyed working with people, consulting with them, having, and even though people yelled at you, and school board politics are very fractious. Parents are very passionate about the opportunities for their children. And there were a lot of issues that really brought out crowds of people who wanted to yell at the local school board trustees. But what I found was that I didn't really mind that. And maybe it was my Soviet experience that I would think to myself, well, they can't do this in the Soviet Union. That part of living in a democracy is that those who have the political power are accountable. And people don't have to be, it's nice if they're polite to you, but the point is that, that's not, deference isn't what you are looking for from the public. You're looking hopefully for respect and collaboration and, to work together to do good things. So I discovered that I really liked it, that I felt it was useful, and I seemed to have a talent for it. I'm a good communicator. And I think a lot of politics is teaching. I was a teacher. I became a university And I always felt that most people could understand anything if you explained it to them, and didn't use jargon, if you started at the beginning and explained what you were talking about. And that was an important part of creating a public that could exercise their franchise intelligently, and to bring people into the world of policymaking. That there's nothing, it's not like, elect us and we'll figure it out, and we'll come back to the next election. No, it was, how do you engage people? And what I also learned, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here because you asked me a short question and I'm giving you a very long answer. But through all my political career, I found one of the most rewarding things was the work I did in consulting and going out and meeting people, whether I was a member of the legislature or later when I was in Parliament, to talk to people about how would you be affected if we did this. And so you learn a lot. So the lessons you learn in local government, whether it's school board or parks board or city council, are actually a very good training for any kind of role, because you don't go somewhere else to serve your constituents. You're face to face, nose to nose with people. But all your instincts get developed in that particular context. And I think it served me well.
Absolutely. I want to dive into your political history and the history outside of politics. So when you ran for school board, you were already a lawyer at that point? Were you practicing law?
No, I actually was a law student. So I went to law school while I was on the school board. And my second term, I was chairman of the school board. So in third year law school, I was chairman of the Vancouver School Board. And then I decided that maybe I should, step back a little bit so that I could graduate from law school. And then what happened was, in my third year of law school, I was approached by some people in the provincial legislature to run in the provincial election in 1990. And they said, we'd like you to run with Philip Owen in Vancouver Centre. That was when they were still 2-member ridings. And you probably won't win, but you'd be a very high profile ticket, and you'd keep the NDP, the 2 members who hold the riding, you'd keep them tied down so they couldn't campaign for others. And I said, well, I don't mind doing it. Again, like, you need somebody to do something. Okay, I don't mind doing it, as long as it's not when I'm writing my final exams. Well, the person I was meeting with looked a little pale when I said that, but he couldn't tell me when the election was going to be, because of course it's a secret until it's announced. Well, sure enough, I wrote all the exams while I was campaigning, and I'm happy to tell you that I did graduate, but I would never do that again. And I was pretty silly to make it so hard campaigning. We didn't win, but we got lots of profile and we learned a lot. And that was what I call my kamikaze run in Vancouver Centre.
So did you hold a provincial seat at some point?
I did eventually. I was elected in 1986 from Vancouver Point Grey. And at that, I had actually gone to work in Premier Bennett's office. I think the offer to go and work at Premier Bennett's office came from my kamikaze run in Vancouver Centre. They thought so. And I was at that time a junior associate as a lawyer. I was not practicing law. But it was kind of clear to me that I didn't really want to spend my life practicing law. I loved being a lawyer, no question about it. And and my firm were very supportive and gave me a job after articles, etc. But I kind of felt that this being involved in something bigger than yourself, this was still kind of pulling me. So I accepted to go. I took a leave from my practice and went to work as the executive director of Premier Bennett's office. And then while I was there, he announced that he was stepping down. I decided to be a candidate for leadership, because by that time I'd already been, I had a profile in Vancouver as a municipal politician. And one of his principal secretary, who'd never been elected to anything, decided he was going to run. So I thought, well, if he could run, I could run. And I didn't think I was going to win, but it was the idea of kind of getting some profile if I wanted to run for the legislature, etc. And that was the famous election where Bill Vander Zalm won, and he won. But then when I ran provincially, I was elected, but I was not a soulmate with my premier. So I did the things that I could. But in 1988, when the Mulroney government was running for re-election, Pat Carney was the member in Vancouver Centre, and she, for various health reasons, decided she wasn't going to run again. And she was very concerned that the Progressive Conservatives hold that seat, because otherwise the prime minister would be pretty mad at her if she stepped down and they couldn't hold the seat, and she might not have become a senator if she hadn't been able to hold the seat. Anyway, but she said the only person who could win this seat for our party is Kim Campbell. So people kept bugging me, will you come and run federally in Vancouver Centre? And I had never thought about running federally, but it also became clear to me that I wasn't going to be able to accomplish a lot, because Bill Vander Zalm and I had a real falling out over the abortion issue. When the Morgantown struck down the Canadian abortion law, Bill Vander Zalm, who was very anti-abortion, said, okay, he was going to stop funding abortions. And of all the people in our caucus, I was the only one who said, well, I don't think you could do that. And I think that's a terrible idea. You shouldn't do it. And it flies in the face of the spirit of the Supreme Court decision. Anyway, to make a long story short, it sort of, convinced me that maybe my utility at the provincial level, had been exhausted. So in 1988, in the fall of 88, 3 weeks into the election campaign, the writ had already been dropped. I was nominated to be candidate in Vancouver Centre. And so that was not really a good way to start. And there were two very strong candidates against me. Actually, the NDP and the Liberals had both nominated very good candidates, Tex Enemark for the Liberals and Joanna Den Hertog for the NDP. And many people thought Joanna would win. And as they're out there campaigning, I'm doing better and better. But slowly, my numbers are going up. And they just on election night, I mean, if the election had been a week later, I'd have won by even more. But but election night, my trend of voter support was up enough so that I actually won the seat by 269 votes, which was pretty narrow. But that started my life as a member of Parliament, and it was really kind of exciting, because I think with Parliament there are such a lot of tradition. And my father was very proud and got a little nameplate made for me, Kim Campbell MP. And I remember, in reading in one of the many books of memoirs by Winston Churchill that I'd read over the years, that he had often said that he had many letters after his name, but the ones of which he was most proud were MP. So it was really magical to be part of that. And that started my adventure as member of Parliament from Vancouver Centre.
Can you tell us what that's like? You are a young lawyer. You had just come from the provincial government. You decided to put your name in the race federally. You win the seat. You get on the plane. You go to Ottawa. You meet Brian Mulroney. What was that era like? What was your experience in coming into the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada and getting to know the way that our federal government works?
Well, it was quite wonderful and mind-boggling, and it was just a larger version of what I experienced in my other levels of government. Because if, for example, in the school board, I sat with people who came from different parts of the city and had different perspectives of different parties. In the provincial legislature, I served with people who came from all over the province of British Columbia and had different, from areas that had different priorities. And then, of course, that's writ large when you go to Ottawa, where you serve with a group of people who come from across the country, and you speak les deux langues officielles, et même que je parle français comme une Vancouveroise. So one of the things I did was start working on improving my French. But it was kind of magical. And again, I loved that sense of being part of a community of people that I otherwise would not have met, who came from many different places. And the reality check of understanding the different ways that people from different parts of the country see the country, their priorities, what they think is important. So it was really very exciting. And so Parliament had to meet, because I don't know, well, you're too young to remember, you probably weren't even there. But the theme of the 1988 election was the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. The Mulroney government had negotiated the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, but it had to be ratified by Parliament. And it did pass in the House of Commons, where his party had a large majority. But the Liberals still had a majority in the Senate, because the Senate are appointed and the people sit till 75. And so for that first Mulroney mandate, there were still a majority of Liberals in the Senate. And they had refused to ratify the treaty. They said, we won't do it without an election. And in an interesting way, although I don't think that the Senate, the unelected, unaccountable Senate, should be overturning the decisions of the House of Commons. In that particular instance, I didn't think it was such an outrageous thing to do, because the government had not run in 1984 on a platform of free trade with the United States. And in fact, this free trade agreement, the negotiations actually started when the MacDonald Royal Commission reported in 1985. And it recommended that Canada enter into negotiations for a free trade agreement with the United States. But when Brian Mulroney, when those issues came out at first, when people say to Brian Mulroney, what do you think about free trade with the United States? He had kind of the same knee-jerk reaction that a lot of people had, which was, oh no, that's a non-starter. They're so much bigger. We'd never do that, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, if you look at free trade agreements between large and small countries, actually the smaller countries benefit disproportionately. It's actually a bigger deal for them because they get access to this very large market and all of the economies of scale that come from that. So when the MacDonald Royal Commission recommended that, I mean, to his credit, Brian Mulroney took it seriously, because it was the most profound, in-depth, detailed analysis of the Canadian economy and polity, certainly since World War II and maybe in the 20th century. And the chair of it was Dominic MacDonald, who was a Liberal. So it wasn't even there was no partisan interest in it for him, but he took it seriously, and his government. And incidentally, Pat Carney, my predecessor in Vancouver Centre, was a Minister of Trade, and she was very instrumental in negotiating that agreement. So that was a big deal. So, but once we were elected in the fall of '88, we had to get started to pass legislation, because the free trade agreement was supposed to go into effect January the 1st. So we needed to get the legislation passed to ratify the agreement. And it was interesting because before I had come to Parliament, parliamentarians were trying to make the rules of Parliament more civilized, easier for people. And one of the things they had done away with was night sittings, because people wanted to go home to their families. And but when I went to Parliament, they reinstated night sittings, because it was the only way they could get all of the stages of the bill through Parliament in time for it to go into force on January the 1st. So I had a very special experience then, because we had night sittings, which meant that I had to be on duty and available in case there were votes and things, which meant that I got to have dinner in the evenings in the parliamentary dining room with a lot of the veterans and listen to their wonderful stories about all the hijinks they used to get up to and things that had been done at various times. And it was really so as a way of getting socialized. It turned out to be a very good thing, because I got to meet and interact with my colleagues more than I might have if we hadn't had that pressure and we weren't meeting at night and it was just in the day. But I will tell you something else too about that, if I can, about the kind of people that you serve and what you learn, and why I think public life is so important, why it's such a learning experience, and how you have these, like as women, we know how aggravating it is when people assume that we can't do things, which in fact we can do. We can leave buildings in a single bound. Many people think we can't. But one of my colleagues was a man named Bill Kempling, who was the representative of Burlington in Ontario. And he was, to put it mildly, spherical. He was a very fat person. And when we would eat in the parliamentary dining room, and there was a dessert, he would always have a second piece of pie. And I would look at Bill Kempling. And he was kind of a lot of fun. And I sort of just thought, here's Bill Kempling, I don't know, he was a businessman, I think, in Burlington, and then, ran for parliament, whatever. But but I realized later that he was so much more than that. And we actually had, when the Japanese emperor died, there was a big controversy about whether our Governor General would go to the funeral. And the Prime Minister wanted him to go, and it was up to the Prime Minister, but the Governor General didn't want to go because he would miss important Remembrance Day things. And so there was a big tension between Rideau Hall and the Prime Minister. And a lot of people said, well, why should our Governor General go? I mean, they were enemies in the war and they were terrible. And then Bill Kempling, I heard him on the radio one morning with CBC talking about his own experience in World War II. And he had fought in the Asian theater of war. So he had actually fought the Japanese. And in fact, he was in Burma, and he walked 1,500 miles through the jungle when he was in Burma to safety when he was serving there. And that, so my view is that, you walked 1,500 miles through the jungles of Burma. You want a second piece of pie? You have a second piece of pie. Because I'll bet wondered if you were ever going to have a piece of pie ever again. But anyway, and he talked about that when he was in the war, that he had taken something from the body of a dead Japanese soldier. There was a flag and it had writing on it, Japanese flag. And he had taken it. And years later, he sort of felt guilty that he'd taken it because it belonged to that person. And he did some research and got in touch, I don't know whether with the Japanese embassy, to find out whether he could find out who it had belonged to and what it was. Well, it turned out that the flag was a souvenir from a going away party for this soldier, that before he had gone to send overseas, his family and friends had a party for them, and all his friends had signed. So the writing on the flag were the names of his friends. And they were able to track down who it had belonged to. Obviously, he died because Bill took it from his body. And Bill was able to go to Japan and give it to this man's family. And he talked about how wonderful they were and how grateful they were to have this souvenir and this thing that their loved one had been carrying with him, close to him throughout the war. And he talked about the Japanese. He said the Japanese today, they're not the Japanese that we fought in World War II. They're very different people now. And it's really, and he was so wonderful, so humane, so generous spirited, and with a credibility, because he had been there. He had been there, and the fact that he had survived and come back to Canada and been able to be a two-piece of pie eating member of Parliament was a miracle. And I remember thinking, you just can't tell who people are, because he would never. I mean, when they all talked about their war stories, the war stories they were talking about were when they were in Parliament. But he would never talk about that. But I thought to myself, now I know why the people of his community wanted him to represent them, because I'm sure in every other thing he's done in his life, he's exhibited that same kind of humanity. But as my colleague in Parliament, I just saw part of him. And he once got into trouble because Sheila Copps got his goat and he hollered something that was not nice to her. And he felt terrible as soon as it was out of his mouth. He was so embarrassed because he was actually, not sexist in any way. And she just really got his goat. And I remember, that, feeling very protective of him, because I said, this is, we can all make stupid mistakes, but this is a man of such a deep character. So these were the kinds of people that I got to know. And when I was Justice Minister and I was advising the Department of National Defense, this was before I became Defense Minister, that they needed to end their policy discriminating against gays in the military. This was a big deal, actually. Oh, and it was actually, I also, as Justice Minister, brought in amendments to the Canadian Human Rights Act to make sexual orientation a prohibited ground of discrimination. And of course, it was very controversial. It's hard for people to remember how people thought about gay, LGBTQ issues. We didn't even call them LGBTQ issues in the late 80s, early 90s. But after, and I remember when I was speaking, when we were going to make these changes to the Canadian military policy, and I'm explaining this, all these things, I don't have to get into the details now, but there were a lot of people in our caucus who were sure that there was a cabal of gay lawyers in the Department of Justice, and I was putty in their hands, and they were pulling my, I mean, it was just, these were difficult issues. But as we were having this quite intense caucus meeting about whether this bill would go forward, one of our colleagues from the Maritimes, very well respected, fairly, because he stood up and he said, I had a gay son, and he was one of the first people in Canada to die of AIDS. And when he told me about his lifestyle, I actually broke with him and told him I couldn't support that. And he said, and what made me change my mind were my other children. And so I reconciled with my son, and I'm very sad that he actually died of this terrible disease. And there was, the whole room was so quiet. But it was, again, somebody kind of taking the risk to share something personal and showing a kind of humanity and the capacity to learn and grow, and how this influenced something that would come out of the policy process of the government of Canada, so that my amendments to the Canadian Human Rights Act, where I could table them. And so when it's such an education. So you go to try and do all the things that you can do. And you have to work with colleagues, and you have to create partnerships, often with people that don't share your views. But it is quite interesting. I mean, Pierre Trudeau once said, he was very dismissive of members of parliament. He said, oh, off the hill, they're nobodies. And I thought, no, actually, it's on the hill, they're nobodies. Because if, as backbenchers, they don't get a chance to participate, you disempower them. But when you go to their ridings and you see them in the context of the communities that they represent, you understand why they're there. You understand what kinds of people they've been in their own communities and how respected they are, and why people ask them to take on this responsibility. So they are somebody's. And that's why when I ran for the leadership, one of my most important ideas was that I wanted to enhance the role of private members of parliament, because I knew that I didn't get to be anybody unless they were elected. I mean, when the Prime Minister made me Minister of Justice, well, the only reason he could do that was because he had a majority, and these people all got elected. So I created this document called Doing Politics Differently, where I really looked at ways in which the private members of parliament could be more recognized. And think that was one of the reasons why I had a lot of caucus support when Brad Mulroney stepped down, when I became a candidate for leadership, because people
Let's talk about, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you for a minute, because I want to move to 93. And I want to give a little bit of a background before we do that for our listeners. Mulroney was facing a federal election in 93. His popularity had plummeted. So all of the polls were showing at that time that he would be heavily defeated in that general election. So he announced his retirement from politics in February of 93, and a leadership race was called. I'm curious about two things. The first is the catalyst for you to decide to put your hat in the race. And then I guess the second part of my question is, on the other side of that, on election night. So take us through that time period to decide to run for leadership. You beat Charest in the nomination process, and then you become Prime Minister of the country, and the lead up to the general election and election night. Can you share with us your thoughts on that?
Well, when I went to Ottawa, my first cabinet portfolio, almost as soon as the government was formed, in the first new cabinet after the first parliamentary session. Oh, I was going to say, in that first parliamentary session, I was asked to give the address in reply to the speech from the throne. And this and the Prime Minister asked me if I would give this speech, and everybody thought that was an interesting sign, because usually he would ask somebody that was sort of a rising star. And this is like the first parliamentary session after we've come back from the election. And when I was giving that speech, I actually spoke in French as well as English. And my then husband was sitting up in the gallery, and he said it was very interesting, because as I started speaking French, Mulroney leans over to Don Macinkowski, his deputy prime minister, and very clearly is saying, she speaks French. He didn't realize that I spoke French. Anyway, so I became Minister of State for Indian Affairs and Northern Development. And there's a whole funny story about how I almost mucked up my own cabinet appointment by not going to the meeting when I was supposed to. But anyway, I was appointed, and I used to get invited to go to people's constituencies to speak at their annual general meetings. I mean, cabinet ministers, you get invited. And people were interested in me. They saw me as an up and comer. They were interested in me, and I would go and talk at their various constituency annual general meetings. And people would come up to me after and say, when Mulroney steps down, you're going to be our next leader. And I was totally perplexed by this. And I remember saying to my executive assistant at the time, because I was a junior minister, I didn't even have a chief of staff, I had an executive assistant. I said, what's happening? He said, I think you're going to lead this party, and it's going to happen naturally. But it was very embarrassing because there wasn't a vacancy at the time. And the one thing you don't want is to give people the impression that here you are, this hotshot from BC comes to Ottawa, and next thing she wants to be prime minister. Because I knew what I didn't know, and I really focused. The prime minister gave me the junior ministerial post so that I could learn the ropes without having a lot of media attention. And in Indian Affairs, as it was then known, Indian Affairs and Other Development, we actually had two deputies, a deputy minister and an associate deputy minister. And I asked them if they would meet with me Monday mornings to talk about how Ottawa worked, how you got things done. And I remember after a year, when I got appointed to Justice, Harry Swain, one of them, made a little note saying, I enjoyed our Monday morning conversations. It sure beat working. But the point is that I didn't know. And I also was lucky. I was appointed to two very important cabinet committees, the General Committee of the committee that deals with all the regulations and sort of the whole business of the government comes through there. And it was chaired by Don Mazinkowski, the Deputy Prime Minister. The Special Committee of Council is what it's called. And then I was also appointed to the committee on the GST because we were bringing in the goods and services tax. And this was a special committee that was formed to look at all the particular details, the nuts and bolts of the definitions of what would be included, and that was chaired by the Minister of Finance. So both of those committees, I sat on committees chaired by very powerful members of the cabinet and of the government. So if I did well, it was good to be able to be noticed by those people who would say to the prime minister, Kim Campbell, she does her homework and she's a really good member of the committee, etc. So those were things that were very lucky for me as well. But the momentum towards my becoming a candidate, it wasn't something that I ever tried to do. But it kind of happened, and Michael Fairbairn was right. It kind of happened naturally that people saw this in me. And when I was justice minister and I dealt with a lot of contentious issues, I really worked hard to be respectful of my colleagues and not to be a jerk, because a lot of the issues I dealt with were quite controversial and divisive, even in our own caucus. Gun control being one of them. The Albertans in my caucus were not really gung-ho on my gun control legislation.
They're still not.
So the point I'm making is that I didn't set out to do it, and my chief of staff, eventually, at one point, my EA said, you need a better chief of staff now that you're justice minister. You need somebody better than me. So I got a new chief of staff who was also very astute politically. And in the fall of 92, he wrote a little document about, what it would mean if I did run for the leadership. And he was convinced that Brian Mulroney wasn't going to step down because he was meeting with the campaign committee. And he thought, he can't stay this long and then step down. I mean, he's creating the campaign committee. It's his people, whatever. But sure enough, in February, we were already well into the 5th year of our mandate. We were elected in October, took office in November. So, here we are, well into the 5th year of the mandate. There's no time for a new leader to do much once you get elected.
So the problem was that the prime minister really wanted to have he had a vision in his mind that he wanted this contested leadership, and that was going to draw all this attention to the Progressive Conservative Party and get people interested in it again, etc. The problem was he had also appointed me Minister of National Defense, and I thought, the trouble with defense is that it's a very travel intensive portfolio. And I'm thinking, how am I going to do all the things I need to do as defense minister and not create sort of scandals that I'm, spending government money on things that are actually for my campaign? Because of course, you're campaigning across the country because you have to, win people's delegate support. And then the prime minister said in cabinet one day that he would regard it as great disloyalty if any minister decided to resign to contest the leadership. Just basically saying that, if you resign, it's game over, that nobody close to the prime, that his people that are close to him would be opposed, which was really kind of stupid in a way, because if I wanted to do it, because he knew that I'd been talking about it. And my idea of doing it was not to be disloyal, but on the contrary, to be very loyal, to avoid creating any kind of scandal. It wasn't, but maybe he thought that if you resigned, that you would go out and be critical of him. But I thought, well, that would be sort of silly, because why would I be critical of the prime minister, even though obviously we were having a leadership because he was now the most unpopular prime minister in the history of Canadian polling. But none of us wanted to pile onto the prime minister. He had led our party to 2 majority governments. And, when you do that, you take some hits. I mean, it's hard for people to remember how unbelievably unpopular Pierre Elliott Trudeau was when he left office. He only ever won 1 majority government. And when he left office, even though he'd been prime minister for 16 years and had had 1 defeat, people hated him. Well, years go by and people, calm down and they do a more, judicious review of your political career. And they find that they do have nice things to say about it. That's happened with Brian Mulroney. People hated him, but then people look back and they go, "Well, look at all the good things that he did." Right. Yeah, but you do those things, you're going to make enemies. You create a Canada-U.S. free trade agreement, you're going to make enemies. You bring in the GST. The GST was very good policy, but who wanted to do it? Right. It's like fighting climate change. You got to do it, but nobody wants to take those steps. So anyway, so it was very difficult. So the campaign was really hard. And because I was trying to be the Minister of Defense while I was campaigning and, keeping the accounting of my campaigning totally separate from what I was doing as a minister. But I did win. And it's interesting because I won on the second ballot. No party leader had won on the second ballot, I think, since World War II. Most leadership campaigns, it took at least 4 ballots to get a leader. And it was interesting in the convention hall, because before they announced the results, I knew I'd won because there was a phalanx of Mounties making their way down towards where I was sitting. So it was pretty clear that I was going to become the prime minister designate.
Wait, can we dig in there? Because it doesn't often happen that you win a leadership and you automatically become the prime minister.
Yeah.
So,
well, it happened. Pierre Trudeau that's how he became prime minister.
But
because his party was a governing party. Yeah, no, but if you're
what does it feel like? What is that?
Well, I mean, it's pretty exciting, quite extraordinary. It's sort of, pinch yourself, mind-boggling. Good grief, this is it. Yes, it was very exciting. And
can I just ask about your sleep the night before? Did you have a hard time sleeping, thinking tomorrow I could be the prime minister of this country?
I honestly can't remember. Can't remember whether I had trouble sleeping or not. It was very difficult. But it was really quite thrilling. And and I think what also struck me was how meaningful it was to so many young women in particular.
Yes,
that they sort of in tears. But the other thing too is that I got a very good start, because after I was elected leader, I had about 12 days before I was sworn in. I went to see the prime minister the next day. I was now the prime minister designate, because I had been elected leader, legally elected the leader of the governing party, but I wasn't sworn in as prime minister yet. And I couldn't be until I had the chance to decide who would be in my cabinet, and how that would all go. Mm-hmm. So I went to see Brian Mulroney, and we talked about things, and he was very nice, excited, and I had a nice meeting with him and Mila, etc. But so we set the date for when we'd have the swearing in at Rideau Hall. And in the interim, I had to make certain decisions. I had to choose who was going to be in my cabinet, but I also had made a promise that I would reduce the size of cabinet. It had grown, and it was actually at one of its historical peaks at about 39 members. And I wanted to reduce the size of it, but to do that, I had to make changes in the organization of the ministries of the government. So I sat down with with the clerk of the Privy Council, and I'll tell you an interesting story. And maybe it's a mean thing to say, but I will tell you, because the day after the leadership campaign, I think it was the day after. I think it was the day after. I met with Glenn Shortliff, who was the clerk of the Privy Council, and he met me with a binder, and in that binder were sections, each one of which addressed something that I had promised to do as prime minister during my leadership campaign. with options of how to implement them. So I'm sure he had the same thing for Jean Charest. The point is that his role, because his job would be to serve as the clerk of the Privy Council, the senior public servant, to serve whoever it was that won. And rather than sitting around and waiting, they paid attention to who the leading candidates were and what they were talking about, and understanding that when the leadership campaign was over, there was going to be a very limited amount of time for a new leader to do anything, because we were already in the second half of the last year of the mandate, and I had to call an election. So the election was held still within the mandate. So like I had, a maximum of 4 months to be prime minister. So he was up and running. I was very impressed. He had he talked about things and what I want to do, and so just we had a wonderful time. And that's how I began the process of how I created the Department of Canadian Heritage, how I combined certain ministries of the Department of Public Safety, things that I did to try and streamline the ministries of the government so that I could then appoint ministers to run those departments. At the same time, I then met with the person that the prime minister had appointed to be the chair of the election campaign. And people can do their homework and see who that was. And so that person didn't have a clue what I was about. And his way of explaining that was to say, well, I was supposed to be neutral. I'd have to lead a campaign with whoever won. So I had to be neutral. And I said, well, being neutral isn't the same as being disengaged. Whoever won, you were going to have to lead a campaign, either led by the first woman, Prime Minister of Canada, or the youngest, because Jean Charest was very young.
Right.
So you were going to have, there wasn't like there was a cast of thousands. There were like 2 people who were likely to be leading the campaign. And surely in that period of time during the leadership campaign, you should have been preparing, alternate scenarios like the clerk of the Privy Council was doing.
Right.
And I was absolutely flabbergasted. And he didn't know anything about me. And when he would come and hear me speak publicly, he was kind of blown away because he didn't know.
Wow.
Why do you think all these people have supported me to be leader?
Right.
It's not because I have them over for tea. It's because I have some strengths, and maybe you're leading the campaign. You ought to know what they are. Anyway, that was the problem was it was too late for me to create my own campaign team.
Yeah.
Looking back, I should have done it. I should have run the risks of doing it. But I had never been a backroom person politically. I'd always been an elected person. And I had been well served in the course of my political campaigning at 3 levels of government by people who were really good campaign organizers, people who really understood it.
Right.
In a way that's often politicians don't. Often, you have people who can tell you stuff and you sort of think, oh, surely I can do this or that. And they'll tell you, well, actually, that probably won't be very constructive and, get you into some trouble. You should, do this, do that, or, how to use polling, all this stuff. Anyway, so that was, so there I was in terms of, so when I was sworn in as prime minister with my new cabinet and the new streamlined ministries of government, it was very popular. And the People I Know party were absolutely thrilled. So that the big party that we had the night of the swearing in, people were so excited because I had done what I said I was going to do. I had made the cabinet smaller because again, we were concerned about, the finances and the financial profile of the government. And this was a way of trying to, keep from the kind of ballooning of, ministers and ministerial staffs and to try and, but it was, I thought, quite an intelligent and good design of a government.
I think they were calling it Campbell mania at the time.
Yeah.
Very popular.
Yeah. Well, and it was interesting because in the summer of 1993, Gallup said at one point that I had the highest approval rating in their polling for a prime minister in 30 years.
Right.
So there were a lot of things that I was doing that people really liked, but there were a lot of people. First of all, there was a lot of sexism, where you don't get the benefit of the doubt. Sexism is not people saying, oh, we don't want a woman. Sexism is simply judging you according to a standard that you don't apply to anybody else. So that any little flub you make, any misstatement becomes blown all out of proportion, because it means people can say, you see, I was right. She was not up to the job. And you're dealing with that all the time. You never get the benefit of the doubt. So that was difficult.
If we
But there
fast
were also
forward,
a lot of people who hated Brian Mulrooney and who thought that if I could win the election, it would somehow vindicate him. So that was also a factor of it. But there was also the other factor, the underlying structural factor, which was that when Lucien Bouchard had resigned from our government and had created the Bloc Québécois, he was able to take a lot of our Quebec vote.
Yeah.
And Preston Manning, with the Reform Party, had taken a lot of our Western vote. And while it was hard to believe that people would vote for a party that couldn't form a government, in fact, they did. People were mad. They were angry at Brian Mulrooney. And maybe they were prepared to be, uncommittal about me, because there were a lot of people in the media, not giving me the benefit of the doubt, in a sense. And I'm not saying this to, I'm sure I make lots of mistakes, etc. But there was just a general, challenge of trying to get people to take you seriously.
And you also didn't have the benefit of time, right? You had for our listeners, you had to call a general election in October of 93. That was the latest, I think, right?
Yeah,
That
well,
you could call the election.
I had to drop the writ in September. The writ was dropped in September because the election had to be held, and we had a shorter election period than we'd had the previous election. But yes, because otherwise the constitutional hook comes and pulls you off. Because sorry, time's up. You can't say anything.
Do you ever think about if you? You must have thought about it, but with more time. You were really behind the 8 ball. You had 4 months until an election would be held. If you had had another year, if you had had more time with the popularity that you had out of the gates, do you think that things would have been different?
It's very hard to know. It's very hard to know because the deficits that I had as being a woman, for example, that I wasn't married at that time, that my marriage had broken up. That might have gotten worse. That might have, created more problems for me. A lot of those things could have, it's easy to say, well, it might have been better, and it might have been. Certainly, it would have given me a chance to put a new face on the government.
Yes.
Which I didn't really have time to do.
Yes.
And that was really very difficult. And if we had an election and we'd won it, then I would have had a new team of people.
Yes.
To build a government with and do all of that. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I don't think anybody does.
Right.
And would Lucien Bouchard have kept his? The Bloc Québécois is still going.
Yeah.
And for quite a number of elections. The irony was that he became the leader of the official opposition.
Yeah.
Because he took so much of the Quebec vote.
Yeah.
And maybe I would never have been able to get that back.
Right.
And Lucien, of course, he went on to be Premier of Quebec. He had his own kind of following, etc. And in the West with the Reform Party, and eventually the evolution of what had been the Progressive Conservative Party, the Reform Party, they knew they couldn't win as reformers, and then they became, the Canadian Alliance, and, they changed their names, whatever. But they never came anywhere near being able to govern until they were able to create a partnership with what was left of the Progressive Conservative Party,
right,
which was very divided because the Reform Party and their successors were much more right wing than the Progressive Conservative Party had been. So it has never been replaced, and I am not a member of the current Conservative Party of Canada because it's just not the same party.
And we want to
talk about that.
Yeah.
Well, I often say, politics is an art, it's not a religion. And partisanship is useful because it gives voters choices. If you know that a certain party has a particular center of gravity of the things that are important to it, then even though you might not agree with everything, you might feel comfortable voting for their candidates. And given the fact that even among the candidates, there will be differences depending on the region that they represent and whether they're urban or rural or etc. So even within a party, you have differences. But if the center of gravity of a party is just, way off for you. I mean, the reason, I suppose in some ways that there are people who said, well, you should just like the liberal. There are a lot of ways, and I have a lot of things in common with liberals, that I'm quite socially liberal. I think the thing that kept me from ever being a liberal was that I just felt that they had one ideology, which was to have power. And they were also artifacts of the power triangle of Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. And growing up in British Columbia, I didn't feel that necessarily embraced me, that they got me. And I felt that the Progressive Conservative Party, when it was led by Brian Mulroney, was a much more inclusive party in terms of the regions of the country. And although there were a lot of people in the West who objected to the strength of the Quebec caucus because there were some, soft nationalists who'd become part of Brian Mulroney's team. But when I was in cabinet, the Western ministers, we used to tour the West, and the West had never been as powerful in a national cabinet as it was in those years. We had major portfolios that were held by Western ministers. So it was a much more geographically inclusive government. And yes, Brian Mulroney wanted to, he should sort of complete the undone business, what he thought was the unfinished business of the patriation of the Constitution, by trying to get Quebec to sign on, and that for the whole Meech Lake Accord and all of that stuff. And there were people, who disliked him for that because they were hostile to Quebec. But that's the reality of governing in this country, that we have regional differences, loyalties, and cleavages that can be translated into, sources of political animosity and partisan divide.
Yeah, and we're seeing that today still. We're still talking about these regional differences very strongly. I want to just ask you about the current political climate in Canada. We're seeing, a poll came out a couple of days ago showing that the Conservative Party of Canada is really leading in the polls. We're a year from a federal election. What are your thoughts on some of the big issues that are currently happening, or the political climate that exists currently in Canada?
Well, I think the existential issue is climate change. And as a matter of principle, I would never vote for a climate denier or somebody who doesn't take the issue seriously. Now, I know if your political base is the oil fields of Alberta, that might be tricky, but there are processes in place to try and ratchet down that involvement. And the reality, if you can't deal with that, I remember going to speak to the leadership of one of the major oil companies when I was at the University of Alberta in 2015, when I was leading the Peter Lougheed Leadership College. And I talked to them. I said, climate change is real, and you have to decide what your future is going to be. And, do you want to be an energy company? Are you going to just, phase out, or can you use the profits that you're making now to continue to provide value to shareholders in a different way? And they were all kind of like, because, I wasn't, you can't pretend. These are really, really important issues. And so I find that the current Conservative Party does not, in my view, address the issues as I think they need to be addressed. I also think that in terms of foreign policy, that Russia is an existential threat. And I think that people who want to play footsie with Donald Trump and think he's amusing don't get it. So, the choices are not great for me. I know, it doesn't really matter. My vote's not going to make a huge difference. But the point is that I think it's hard, and I don't. I think there might be some quite good people in the Conservative Party. I have problems with their leader.
What can you elaborate on that? Is there something?
I think he's a liar and a hate monger is what I think he is. So that about sums it up.
Yep.
All right.
It's been 30 years since you held office. Does it surprise you today that another woman has not held that office in Canada? Does it surprise you?
Well, it disappoints me. people often say, what will it take to have another woman prime minister? Well, that woman has to be elected leader of a party that can form a government. I was hoping when Stephen Harper stepped down that maybe Rona Ambrose would go for the leadership. I thought she did a very good job as interim leader. I think she just didn't really, I think she wanted to move on with her life. And it was a pity because I think she would have been, she would have had a really good shot at it.
Agree.
And I don't know, who will succeed to Justin Trudeau. But given the length of time he's been in government, if a woman succeeds him, she might run into the same problem I did, which is that there's, unless there's a lot of time, unless he steps down with 2 years to go in a mandate, it might be very difficult for a new leader, male or female, to put a new face on a party, or reframe the party's goals in ways that can undo unpopularity of a leader. And incidentally, this is not a criticism of Justin Trudeau. I mean, you can't govern without becoming unpopular. I mean, the idea that you're going to be in power for a long time and everybody's going to be, still love you, and he's not perfect. Has his government done some good things? Yes, I think it has. But, it's not, I know there are a lot of people who really don't like him, and that's a hard thing to deal with. I mean, Brian Mulroney faced that too. And I think Brian Mulroney, if he thought he could win, would have run again.
For sure. Yeah.
But, but I think that's also hard for a proud person. You begin that you're indispensable. And I think with Brian, I don't think whoever won the leadership in 93 could have won. And I think that the 2 seats, it wasn't, now, I mean, in the last 2 weeks of campaign, Jean Charest just went back to his riding and campaigned there, and he was one of the 2 seats. I didn't have that luxury, so I couldn't go to Vancouver Centre and try and see if I could hold on to my seat because I had to campaign in the whole country.
Right.
But I don't think that Jean Charest would have won that election either. Might he have done better? I don't know. I mean, I really don't know the answer to that, but I don't think he would have won the election. And I think that the division, the Bloc Québécois and the Reform Party divisions were factors that really made it extremely difficult. So I think that whatever happens with the Liberals, I'm almost, Justin Trudeau may be afraid to launch that dynamic. I don't know.
Yeah.
We want to ask you 2 more questions, if that's okay, before we wrap here. Social media is something that we talk a lot about on the podcast, and we've had former politicians come on and talk about the impact that social media has made in their experience in Parliament. In 1993, social media didn't exist, and most people didn't even have computers in their homes at that point. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your experience might have been like had you had social media existed? Do you ever think about that in the context of your own experience?
Yeah, it might have been worse. It might have been better. I think there are several things you have to remember. That scurrilous news coverage and disinformation is nothing new.
Yeah.
Social media and the internet have done is just increase the volume and speed of it.
Right.
And also the ability to, the deep fake challenge, the ability to, there's an old saying, that a lie is halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. The extraordinary amount of disinformation. I mean, I'm just reading this stuff about all these things that the Trumpian people, say about Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden has his strengths and his weaknesses, but a lot of the things that are said about him are just simply demonstrably false. But if they're out there and when I was young, people used to do something and they'd advertise something and they'd say, as seen on television. And we sometimes forget that even television was a very powerful medium. So, the Sean Hannitys and people like that of this world can, or Rush Limbaugh on the radio. I mean, there are a lot of ways in which people can use media that aren't even social media.
Yeah.
To spread lies and disinformation, and criticism. So, I think there's no question that it's an order of magnitude bigger.
Yeah.
And what people are concerned about with artificial intelligence is the capacity to make deep fakes to convince people even more persuasively that what they're seeing is somebody saying something that that person never said.
Right.
But it is worrisome. There's no question about it. And I think we have to do everything that we can to try and create media literacy among young people and the capacity to be critical, but also to, I look at somebody like an Elon Musk, buying Twitter. I mean, the social media platforms have to have some responsibility, and governments need
Yes.
to create regulations that will protect people
Yes.
from, in Canada, we've always felt that the airwaves were a public resource, which is why we have the CRTC and all of these things. And it's very difficult to deal with these things. People think that they're just their own, private bailiwick, that they can do whatever they want with.
Yes.
It was kind of nice when Donald Trump was knocked off Twitter, and of course he's never really much come back. He's got his own thing now, but it is really, you just get exhausted by the volume of it. And it's very, very hard to swim your way up through it. But also, even before social media, when I was at the Kennedy School as a fellow at the Shorenstein Center in the early, in 2001, when was I there? 2002? No, I was at the Shorenstein Center in 1995. And Tom Patterson wrote a book called Out of Order about the change in media. And for example, the decline in the size of a sound bite.
Right.
So that direct quote in the print media had gone from like 13 inches to 1 inch, and sound bites had gone down to about 10 seconds. So even before social media, there were lots of pressures in the media that worked against thoughtful consideration of what somebody is trying to say. Completed thoughts. I mean, when I was a little girl, newspapers used to sometimes print almost whole speeches that politicians might have given. And, maybe only the keeners read them. But the point is that they were there and they were available, now. But even when I was in public office, we were already seeing the compressing of those communications.
For sure. I have a final question, although I wish we could talk to you for hours more. We have produced this episode for International Women's Day. And that's why it's such a special episode for us. So I guess my question to you is, what do you say to women about the importance of being involved in politics? Not necessarily putting your name on the ballot, because we are beyond a ballot, but why should women care? Why should they be involved?
Well, they should care and be involved because their lives depend on it. Because somebody's going to have power. And it should either be them or people chosen by them, because those people make decisions that affect your life. You can't escape it. You can't, nothing will protect you, not even wealth. May give you more protection than some things. And I think it's important for women to understand that there are a lot of narratives that try to undermine the value of women. But the more you look at the narratives that truly reflect what women have done and have accomplished, the more you realize that women are just as smart and just as able as men. And they have a huge amount to offer, a huge amount they have offered in all fields. When I was young, people would say, well, where is the female Einstein? I didn't know, but that there are answers to that question. Women whose contributions to science are still, and mathematics are still foundational, but we don't hear about them because when people think you don't belong, they don't tell your stories. So we have to tell women's stories, and women have to understand that if they don't have a say in who's going to make decisions that affect them, they can be deeply, deeply wounded by what those decisions would be. And I look at all the politics around reproductive rights in the United States, and people, men making decisions about whether women can have abortions, and without any understanding of what that means, that women, who are miscarrying and cannot get medical treatment because doctors are afraid that they will be in breach of the law. I mean, that's how Ireland came to legalize abortion. When a woman was miscarrying and because the fetus still had a heartbeat, even though it could not survive, it was a non-viable pregnancy. And so she died. And all of a sudden the people of Ireland sat up and said, well, wait a minute, that's not what we meant. No, it wasn't. And when people say this is a matter between a woman or a doctor, it's because it's complicated. It isn't just a question of somebody who gets pregnant and wishes they weren't. It's a whole range of experiences and challenges. And if we don't realize that the great thing about democracy is we have the rule of law, and the people make the laws. But if all the people are not involved in making the laws, we'll have a much diminished democracy, because the laws are there and we have to care who makes them and what they are. And I go back to my own experience and why I say to women that my involvement in elected office at all three levels of government was incredibly rewarding, because I got a chance to make some policies that I think are important. I was, I was the author of much of the modern sexual assault law in Canada. And I wrote that law, not lying on my pillow thinking about it out of my head, but by consulting with women, by finding out the reality of women who weren't like me, a white middle-class university educated urban woman from Vancouver Centre. My reality was not every woman's reality. And I reached out and tried to listen to every woman's reality so that I could help to craft legislative proposals that would be just and fair. So, it does matter. And you don't have to run yourself. Write a check for somebody that you support. Talk them up. Never denigrate democracy. And I go back to, what I've said before. I'm sitting here in Italy, in a country where there are all sorts of graves of young Canadians, if they're 22, they're old, who gave their lives in World War II to try to push back the forces of fascism. Our democracy was paid for at a very heavy price, men and women. And we need to value that gift and preserve it, because if we don't, we will be very sorry, and our daughters will never forgive us.
What a way to end.
Happy International Women's Day.
Oh, wow. You are just so brilliant. And I can't thank you enough for your willingness to come on and share with our audience your story, your experience, your advice. Like Amanda said, we could have you here for another couple of hours, and we do hope that you will come back. I quickly want to share my personal story of being a young, I think I was 10 at the time you became prime minister, girl in Vancouver, hearing that a woman from Vancouver became the first ever female prime minister. And so for me, this conversation is really personal. And I want to thank you for supporting our work and for continuing your work in advancing women's opportunity in politics around the world. So thank you.
The unit of human understanding is the story. So keep telling our stories, because that's how we build our strength. So I thank you guys for doing this. It's wonderful. You could be sitting at home just eating chocolates, binge watching something on Netflix, but instead you're out there reaching the folks with the stories they need to hear. So bless you. That's great.
Thank you so much for being here. You moved me to tears. Thank you.